Hi, I'm told we should get started. Welcome, everybody. For any of you I haven't met yet, my name is Aftab Irfan. I am the executive director here at the Centre for Dialogue. And you're in our space here. Can I see, how many of you, this is your first time in this room? Oh, okay, quite a few people. That's great. That's great. Let's actually just see a little bit more about who is here. How many people are here because they're deep into AI? Like, you know quite a bit. Maybe you work in this area. There's some hesitant hands and some confident hands. Okay, perfect. How many of you are here? Because it's like, this is a brand new topic. I don't know anything about it. I hope I get some good information. Okay, great. That's quite a few. Are there any students in this room? Any SFU students or other students from elsewhere? Okay, great. That's actually impressive because this is the week of exams and finals and all of that, and so I did not imagine any students would be out. Thank you for being here. Any researchers here? Any scholarly researchers? Yes, and the come here on the stage. Do we have any retirees? Some retirees in the room, yes, that's awesome. Some of you are kind of on the edge, haven't quite decided, maybe after tonight. Great. Okay, that's great. So we have often in these events a real mix of folks in the room, and so I'm really happy to welcome you into this space. And before anything else, we're going to hand it over to Elder Marie Hooper from the Coquitlam First Nation, who's one of a few elders in residence here at SFU, and she's going to do a territorial acknowledgement.
Good evening, everybody. I raise my hands up to Creator Ancestors to all of you here today. Welcome, students, staff, faculty, our President Joy Johnson, and sorry if I don't know all the other names of the people here, but I welcome you all. Simon Fraser University respectfully acknowledges the unceded traditional territories, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Coquitlam nations on which SFU is located. My name is Elder Marie. My voice is a little scratchy. We had a huge fire on Coquitlam yesterday, so I did a lot of yelling early hours of the morning, calling people to get our elders out and panicking. Although I am trained in emergency response, but I actually panicked, so excuse my voice. Everybody's okay, by the way. My name is Elder Marie. I'm from the Coquitlam First Nations. I'm a storyteller, knowledge keeper, ambassador for my nation, Coquitlam. I'm in residence at the ISC in Burnaby Indigenous Student Centre. I travel to Surrey and Vancouver campuses, SFU, for openings, presentations, workshops, and conferences. Welcome to the 2024 Bruce Liz Welch Community Dialogue on Artificial Intelligence. When I first read that, I thought, I know about intelligence, but artificial intelligence. So I'm a little bit clueless on that since read up a little bit on it. So I'm looking forward to hearing more tonight and learning a lot. And I feel honored that I'm not the only one that doesn't know about artificial intelligence, but that's new technology that we have here today and moving forward with this annual event programming will engage the community with academics to explore innovative approaches to the local issues through cross-sectoral dialogue. So that's all I'll say about that. I'd like to say a short prayer. Creator Lord, we look at your world and we praise for diversity all around us. Thank you for the gift of relationships, our connections with people, animals, and the land. Help us to see the differences in diversity as strengths. May we listen to understand, reveal us to Creator, your way of reconciliation. Guide us into the right relationships with all living things. Help us to listen compassionately, to speak humbly, to act justly. May we soar like the eagle to fly to new heights and have the courage and wisdom to get us there. I'd like to introduce my daughter Tina right over here. She works for our nation in reconciliation coordinator, but she wears many other hats and is going up the ladder, so to speak, and I'm very proud of her. First Nations people say Natsamat, meaning one heart, one mind, Haichka.
Thank you. That was perfect. And Elder Marie, thank you for being here when there's so much also going on in your life and in your community. And I think that's I mean that there's a lot going on in a lot of lives and communities. So I'm just so happy that we start with an acknowledgement of our whole being as we come into the room, and the acknowledgement of the land and the animals. With this topic, artificial intelligence, we tend to be somewhere else. And so it's just maybe important to come back to earth as often as possible in this moment and throughout this session. My pleasure now to introduce Dr. Joy Johnson, president of SFU. Joy is a little bit of a frequent flyer in this hall. She comes here for a variety of events, and we just are so grateful for your support for dialogue, for this form of dialogue, like real community dialogue. And also, I know this topic is of interest to you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Aftab. And let me just begin by thanking Elder Marie. Lift my hands up to you. I want to really thank you for starting us off in a good way and acknowledging the land that we're on. I too would like to acknowledge the land we're on here in the Vancouver campus, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And, SFU is really focused on upholding truth and reconciliation. So it's always important to acknowledge our land. I'm excited about tonight, I've got to say. First of all, there were really good snacks out there. So thank you for that. I always appreciate that. But I always love coming to this room and spending time in dialogue on important issues. And in particular, artificial intelligence is a topic we do need to be having dialogue about. So very pleased about that. I want to begin by acknowledging the donors who have made this possible. And I'm hoping out there in virtual land somewhere, Bruce and Liz Welch might somehow be able to hear my words. But Bruce and Liz Welch are amazing longtime supporters of Simon Fraser University. And they really are interested in this notion of dialogue and how community can come into the university and be part of a dialogue on important issues of our day. And over the years, Bruce and Liz have really contributed to SFU in so many ways. Bruce's role, he was a convocation founder. Liz has been a leader in terms of our anniversary campaigns at the university. They've been generous in terms of giving to the university, but they're also really wise people and wise enough to think about the importance of dialogue in our lives. And so very, very grateful to them. We couldn't do this tonight without their support. And so I'm going to ask you to put your hands together, even though they're not here, to thank Liz and Bruce Welch. So I just want to say a few more words about artificial intelligence. It is of great deal of importance to our society right now, but to a university as well. And I'm really excited that at SFU we're starting to think about a strategy related to artificial intelligence. I was saying earlier to the panelists that I really think that no student should graduate from university right now without some kind of understanding of AI. It's just going to be essential for all of us to have this kind of understanding. And I know that we're kind of in the same boat as many other organizations. We as a university are struggling to think about how we can adapt and utilize AI in our day-to-day work, but for our researchers as well. And that's a challenge. And so that's, I think, really why we do need an AI strategy. But on the other hand, I also think we have a role to play in these kinds of dialogue and showing leadership in the area of artificial intelligence. We all might think AI is new, but the researchers at SFU remind me on a regular basis, it's not so new. It just has really come to the fore. And so we have a lot of experts doing work in AI at SFU. Stephanie Dick's here tonight from SFU. Really happy to have you with us. And other experts as well. It's really through conversations like this that we can think deeply together about the challenges that lie ahead for all of us. So I'm here to listen. I'm here to think about how AI is not necessarily just this magical force, but also something that is inevitable in our future, something that we really need to think about how it's going to impact our society, think about what our responsibilities are, and really think about how it is a tool that will shape, the way we do work, not just now, but in the years to come. So challenges lie ahead, but so many other opportunities as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel. And with that, I will pass it back to Aftab. Thank you so very much, everyone, for being here tonight, and welcome to Simon Fraser University.
Awesome. Thank you, Joy. And thank you, Bruce and Liz. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll just do a little bit more framing. I know you're itching to hear from our speakers, and so am I. And just to tell you the context of how we're coming here. So the Center for Dialogue has kind of two main missions. One is to convene dialogues on important issues and move towards shared decision making on important issues, and artificial intelligence would be one of them. The other one is to build the capacity for folks to be leaders in holding dialogue and to be effectively in dialogue. And I think tonight we are kind of here in the spirit of that second part of the mission, which is to learn about this topic so that you can be in the dialogue. And some of you already are, many of you aren't, by the show of hands we could see. And we are trying to spark more of a societal dialogue on this thing that's going to really impact us already, is impacting us. But a lot of us are kind of, we don't know how to get in. And so the literacy that we're trying to build tonight is a really important part of that. And then tomorrow we have a group that is here by invitation for the whole day of policymakers, folks in the industry, civil society, and researchers trying to think like what does BC need to do to better position itself for responsible use of AI, both its growth and kind of making sure that it doesn't do things that we might be a little bit freaked out about, right? And just so I know, who is a little bit scared of the possibilities of AI in this room? Who finds this, for many of us, this is like kind of an unsettling conversation, especially when we don't know very much as we're coming into it. So this is about kind of some myth busting, some giving the history, kind of bringing us onto the same page that we can be in that conversation. Our plan is to do really kind of three things more or less. And so we'll start with a little presentation from my colleague Fergus. We did, in preparation for this event, a public poll. So there was a poll of 1,000 BC residents to understand what is the public opinion about AI. So we're going to present that tonight for the first time. Then we're going to hear from our two main speakers, so Dr. Stephanie Dick and Daniel Barkley. I'm going to come back and introduce you. And then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, first maybe in small groups with somebody sitting next to you, and then with the panel up here. And I will just point, there is on your in front of you, a card that looks like this. It might have a pen stuck to it like this one. But on the back of this card, there are three questions which are for that interactive part of the session. Essentially, the first question is, what did you learn today that you might be able to use? What is something that you learned today that might be helpful to you as you try to participate in this conversation? The second one is, what do you still need to learn, essentially? And the third one really is something that we are hoping you might fill out and leave with us to influence the conversation tomorrow with government and industry and researchers and civil society, which is like, let's imagine that it was 2030 and BC had done something that we're in the right direction, that we got it right with respect to AI, its growth, and its regulation. What would we have done? Like if you're 6 years away from that, what are some things that we might want to look back in 2030 and say, that was a really good idea. I'm glad I was there. I'm glad I did that. If you have any ideas about that, We will feed that into the more policy-oriented conversation tomorrow. So that we'll come back to this piece, but I just wanted to flag it in case you want to take notes on here or on your notepad, and we'll collect these at the end of the day. I think that's really all I need to say by way of framing. I'll introduce Fergus. I never actually know how to pronounce your last name. Is it Linley or Linley? Linley Mota. I don't know anybody's last names. So Fergus has been actually a long-term collaborator with the Centre for Dialogue. He was an undergraduate at SFU in international studies, and then he went off to Oxford and did this master's at the intersection of policy and AI. And so we are very, very happy that he's back leading our dialogue on technology project. And I'll hand it over to you to present the results of the survey.
So, as Aftab just mentioned, I lead something called the Dialogue on Technology Project, which is a new initiative at the Centre for Dialogue focused on AI's social impacts in BC and Canada. We exist in part as a response to the fact that public consultation around AI and governance has seriously lagged. This is true around the world, and it's true in Canada, where consultation processes have often been sort of roundly and consistently criticized for a lack of accessibility, transparency, and civic engagement. Can people hear me better now? I just got it now. Yeah, thanks. This has resulted in a situation where residents are hearing all the time about how AI is going to change our lives, often in very vague ways or ways that change from one day to the next. But very rarely are people asked, what do you want that change to look like? What do you want your own technological future to look like? And to start addressing this question a little bit more seriously, we commissioned, as Aftab mentioned, first of its kind public opinion research to better understand British Columbians' perspectives on AI. We worked with Daniel Savas, a wonderful public opinion researcher who might be in the room right now, but I can't see him, and polling firm Angus Reid to conduct a survey of more than 1,000 residents. Specifically, we wanted to know what is British Columbians' awareness of AI, what are their attitudes towards it, and what are their views on what we should be doing about this as a society. We're excited to share it with all of you, some of the very top-line findings at least, to help frame today's conversation around how we got here and where we might be headed. And if you're curious about looking at those in the sort of more long-form format, they're available on the Dialogue on Technology website, which is at the Centre for Dialogue website. To begin with, just to set the stage, overall we found that BCers are reasonably knowledgeable about AI. A majority were able to correctly spot everyday technologies that use it from a sort of standardized list that we provided with them, and 54% reported having personally used an AI tool to generate text or media in the past. Think ChatGPT. Among the more eye-catching findings from this research, we found that a full 82% of British Columbian residents report feeling nervous about the use of AI in society. Despite what we're hearing in popular discourse, though, that nervousness wasn't just associated with ideas about dystopia or some kind of Matrix-like scenario. In fact, 64% of residents, you'll see there in the bottom left, said they felt AI was just another piece of technology, among many others. Instead, most respondents' concerns were practical and grounded. 86% worried about losing a sense of their personal agency as a result of companies and governments making decisions that might affect their lives. 80% are particularly concerned about social isolation. 70% about AI showing bias against certain types of people, certain groups of people. Beyond that, a full 90% were concerned about deepfakes and other manipulated media you may have heard about. 85% were concerned about their own personal information being used to train AI models. 79% were worried about that classic fear, job displacement as a result of new technology. I should add, a good number also held positive views of AI. A majority were excited about how this technology might push the boundaries of what humans can achieve, and expressed a fascination with the idea that machines can learn, think, assist humans in tasks. In their personal lives, majority of respondents felt positively about AI's potential to help get things done more quickly. But participants in our survey had a pretty clear message for government, and that was regulate now. A majority, 58%, felt that the risks of an unregulated AI tech sector were much greater than the risk that government regulation might stifle AI's future development. But there's a bit of a snag, which is that our institutions themselves have a trust problem. On the one hand, a majority of respondents feel strongly that governments should be responsible for setting rules and limiting the risks of AI, as opposed to leaving it to the tech sector or leaving it to individuals to sort of self-teach or regulate. But at the same time, our study shows that trust in government to manage and develop AI carefully and with the public's interest in mind is pretty low at only 30%. It's even lower in tech companies at 21%, and NGOs sit not much better at 29%. Academic institutions do best on the trust question. Shameless self-plug, with 51% of British Columbians somewhat or strongly trusting them to manage this responsibly. But just over half is still not particularly flattering. Still, we might just have to take it as a call to action. Respondents clarified, it should be said, their information needs when it comes to AI. Interestingly, on the whole, British Columbians do not see technical or scientific knowledge, or even how to use these tools, as the most important piece of information currently missing from our arsenal. They actually express the strongest desire to hear about what government's doing to manage this, or how these systems interact with the economy and with society, what ethical considerations we should be aware of. To zoom out a little bit, it's becoming clear that AI and its governance has a participation problem. And our research shows that the public is ready to join this conversation in a more serious way. Today's event is one part of that process. So thanks for being here.
Awesome, perfect. Great, so maybe I'll introduce Dr. Stephanie Dick as you get your stuff sorted, yes? Okay. Really happy to have Dr. Stephanie Dick with us. She is an assistant professor in the School of Communication here at Simon Fraser University. She's a historian of science, and her specialty is the history of mathematics, computing, and artificial intelligence. She also has a history of, she also has studied the history of tech in policing, which maybe we won't talk about tonight, but I'm also really interested in. She has tons and tons of accolades. I'm not going to go through them in the interest of getting to your presentation quickly, but I will say the more I listen to your interviews and podcasts and all of that, the more I feel like you're just the right person to give us a little bit of a perspective of where is this coming from in the longer history of technologies. What is this moment? And I felt so lucky that you're here with us at Simon Fraser. Thanks for being here tonight.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much to Janet and to Fergus and to the whole team at the Centre for Public Dialogue for putting this event both today and tomorrow together, for including me in it. Thank you so much, Elder Marie and President Johnson, for the introductions, and AFTAB for the welcome. I'm very honored to be here, and I am thrilled that SFU is stepping up to the plate to take some ownership of this conversation and this important moment that we find ourselves in. So, as Aftab mentioned, I am a historian of science by training, and I have spent the last 15 years of my life exploring the histories of mathematics and computing and artificial intelligence. And one of the most important things that I have learned is that there is no automation without profound transformation. Anytime, every time someone says the computer has done a thing, anything. It's recognized a face, it's composed a poem, it's predicted an election, it's solved a mathematical problem, it's proved a mathematical theorem. Every time you hear an announcement that the computer has achieved some goal, that task has had to be fundamentally redefined, fundamentally transformed, reimagined. It has to be put into the terms of the computer. The languages the computer speaks, the languages it works with, its forms of representation, its operations, its capacities. So when we automate, including all of what artificial intelligence does, What we are in fact doing is reimagining, rethinking, translating, transforming, and redefining the kind of work we want done in the world. And so I do not see the history of computing as a history in which computers are getting better and better at doing more and more difficult and complex tasks. I see the history of computing instead as the history of our putting more and more of our world, our concerns, our values, our questions, our knowledge into the terms of the machine. And I don't think we spend nearly enough time paying attention to what those transformations and translations actually entail. Technologists are often very happy to leave out that the translational work has been done. And so in my academic career, I've spent a lot of time exploring what is involved in practice, in actually trying to put more and more of our world and our work and our knowledge and our norms and our practices and our values into the mathematical, technical, algorithmic language of the computer. And I sadly won't be able to get into too much of that in 25 minutes time, but I want to give you an overview of what has been happening to the very idea of intelligence itself, which is, of course, precisely what is at stake in the proliferation of what is called artificial intelligence. We are redefining that term. We are including and excluding different kinds of people, behaviors, capacities from what intelligence is. And so a part of what we're here to do is fight over this category. That's a part of what's at stake in conversations about AI. So what I'm going to do today, before, I wanted to mention quickly that during the COVID-19 pandemic, I was one of the organizers of the first large-scale attempt to bring together the international community of scholars who are increasingly studying the history and various genealogies of artificial intelligence in different social and cultural contexts. And from this work, based at Cambridge University, though online because of the pandemic, we came to realize that a new picture of what AI is was emerging from our collective scholarship. Namely, that AI is not the culmination of a set of digital technologies. It's not just a culmination of what computation is and can do. We came to see AI instead as the culmination of industrialization, and especially of the desire to subject cognition and mental work and thinking to managerial control and industrial principles. And that's the historical picture and background and genealogy that I would like to share in broad strokes with you today, because I think it has to inform the conversations we have about generative AI today. So I'm going to give you a very brief history of intelligence in 3 acts, as it were. And I will begin in the 18th century in Europe during a time of rapid and intense industrialization, driven, of course, by the invention of coal-powered steam engines. Coal-fueled, steam-powered factories started to emerge across Europe at this time, changing where people lived and how they worked, and the systems and structures that created both power and wealth. Increasingly, power and wealth would be consolidated within a managerial class, who increasingly controlled and governed the labor of others. Management in the 18th and 19th centuries became a whole philosophical and scientific project to organize and manage the labor of humans and machines, to be as efficient as possible, as cheap as possible, as profitable as possible. These were explicitly stated goals of industrial management. And one of the most important and influential early theorists for this intensifying world of managerial thinking was a Scottish theorist of early capitalism you've probably heard of by the name of Adam Smith. And in his work on the Wealth of Nations, which circulated very widely across Europe at this time, Smith advocates for one core principle of progress, of modernity, and of industry, which he called the principle of the division of labor. So rather than have one person, some kind of guild craftsperson, make an entire textile from shearing the sheep to pulling the thread to dyeing and weaving the wool, you would break that task down into a series of more basic steps that one person would take on in a repetitive way. In the context of the factory, This transformed human workers more into machine operators who didn't even themselves necessarily undertake the steps in the process, but governed the machines that did so. And this part of the story, of course, I think is fairly well known. Everybody knows about assembly lines and the division of labor, and the factory is a product of industrialization. But I think a lot less well known and extremely important was that there was a cohort of European aristocrats, managers, and philosophers, folks like Charles Babbage, who you might have heard of, or the French engineer Gaspard de Prony, who's much less well known, who were also reading Adam Smith, but wondered if his principle of the division of labor could be applied to the work of the mind in the same way that it had been applied to the work of the body. Could you take what we do in cognition, thinking, calculating, problem solving, reasoning, judgment, decision making, and break it down into a series of elementary steps that could similarly be distributed between people or between people and machines to be undertaken more effectively and more efficiently? So people like Babbage and de Prony spent a lot of time in the 19th century trying to work out how to do this sort of thing for mathematics. Can you take a complex calculation, like a differential equation or some hard logarithm problem, and break it down into a series of basic and elementary arithmetic steps? Could you solve a complex differential equation just by a series of additions and subtractions? And these turned out to be really challenging and interesting mathematical problems, and sometimes the answer was yes. People like de Prony and Babbage found ways to break mathematical calculations down into a series of thousands of additions and subtractions. And this meant that maybe you didn't need to be well educated in mathematics to solve a logarithmic equation. Maybe you didn't even need to be a mathematician. Maybe you didn't even need to know what a logarithm was. All you needed was 100 or 1,000 low-educated, low-skilled, low-paid workers who knew how to add and subtract, and they could add and subtract thousands of times in the aggregate, and when you grouped their labor together, you would have a solution to your difficult mathematical problem. And this was seen as a success of industrial management of the mind. And it also created a whole new kind of job. The people, largely uneducated, who would do these subtractions and additions in the aggregate by the thousands, by the hundreds, were called computers. That word actually referred to the human computer for much more of its history than to a machine. The human computer was the person whose job it was to carry out the mechanical, menial, elementary arithmetic steps which, taken together, would constitute the solution to a difficult mathematical problem. Calculation was once done by the most learned members of society. Mathematical calculation was associated with virtuosic genius and profound intellectual power. If you were the kind of person who could solve a differential equation or a logarithm, it probably meant you were a well-educated aristocrat, somebody wealthy and somebody well-educated. I don't know, oh, there we go. And these human computers were actually employed well into the 1980s, in large part because they turned out to be largely women and people of color who remained cheaper to hire well into the 1980s than it was to license and purchase modern digital computers. And it was also, of course, these human computers who were first replaced and their labor automated by modern digital computers in the 1940s. So with industrialization, the mind, cognition, intelligence, knowledge were subjected to the principles of industrialization and incorporated into the economy. And this paradigm has only intensified. Today we talk about knowledge production, knowledge consumption, knowledge circulation, knowledge mobilization, as if knowledge was some kind of free-floating commodity, not something that inheres in people or in community or in context. And this represented a really significant shift in how intelligence and knowledge were understood in the pre-industrial period as immaterial, interior, sometimes personal, often religious. And it was against that background that thinking was turned into something else, something more rule-bound, something made up of elementary exercises like addition and subtraction. And it was only against the background of industrializing thinking in this way that modern computing and artificial intelligence makes sense. The very concept of intelligence has a history. What counts and doesn't count, what is valued and not valued, changes over time, and often as a function of economic and technological considerations. Part of what is at stake today in this generative AI boom is the very meaning of that word, and who and what gets to be intelligent and performing what types of skill and knowledge production. The first attempts to reproduce intelligence in a modern digital computer, the first so-called artificial intelligence, unfolded in the United States, also in the Soviet Union, during the Cold War. And that's Act 2 in this very quick history of shifts in Western thinking about what intelligence is. In the context of the American Cold War, researchers coming largely from logic, mathematics, and engineering and philosophy were interested in whether there were other facets of human intelligence, human problem-solving and decision-making, the formulation of judgments, the assessment of risk, and so on, that might also be subjected to the principle of the division of labor in this way, that might also be broken down into a series of elementary basic steps that could, maybe at least in principle, be programmed into the computer. That is, they thought maybe this machinery could take on more kinds of cognitive labor than mathematical calculation. Could more facets of intelligence be subjected to industrial management in this way? And a lot of early research in this area took place at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California. Rand was founded in the wake of the Second World War as a kind of think tank, and their primary mandate, given to them by the US Air Force, was to think about what future global wars were going to look like and to try to develop strategies for winning them. It was entirely a Cold War project. This, of course, was a difficult task because there was nothing but uncertainty about those future wars. What nations would fight in them? What geopolitical regions would they be in? What technologies and weapons would they have access to? None of this could be known in advance. How do you study and strategize for a future war in the face of so much uncertainty? And at the Rand Corporation, some of the approaches to studying and research in general were about trying to have robust knowledge in the face of that uncertainty. And a dominant approach developed that was called systems engineering, that tried to bypass this problem by studying warfare in the abstract, by breaking up war into its supposed constituent parts and then studying those in a kind of abstract mathematical way. To the systems engineer, anything could be a system. The government was a system, the transportation infrastructure was a system, communications infrastructure was a system, the weapons on an airplane were a system. And the approach of the systems engineer was to look at those systems, try to abstract from them the formal and mathematical relationships that existed between the component parts, and most importantly, to look at what kind of information circulated between the different parts of a system. And with this set of tools in hand, people at Rand thought they were studying the Bolshevik government, they were studying the trains, they were studying nuclear bombs, they were studying everything, but in the abstract, as formal rule-bound systems. And in that context of systems engineering, entered two researchers by the name of Alan Newell and Herbert Simon, who came to believe that both the human mind and the modern digital computer were systems too, and especially that they were systems of the same kind. Herbert Simon called them species of the same genus, and that genus was information processing systems that took symbolic information as input, manipulated it according to a set of rules, and in so doing could output the solution to a problem, a decision, a judgment. Systems engineering borrowed from and informed the new managerial sciences that were developing at this time. Those invested in the study of management were also more interested in what was abstract and generalizable over what was domain specific and material. Management consultant groups and managerial schools and sciences started emerging around the US at this time were similarly looking for abstract principles that could be applied to all kinds of institutions. Management consultants, for example, have theories about what is the optimal number of underlings for any manager to have. What is the optimal form and frequency of communication between managers? And they don't think it matters whether you're at a fish food company or a university. Those managerial principles were thought to apply. And that faith in abstract logic, abstract rules for optimization ran through the world of early intelligence, or artificial intelligence as well. Newell and Simon believed that human reasoning and intelligence didn't have much to do with our bodies or even our brains, but only with our ability to manipulate symbolic information according to the right rules. And they wanted to break behavior down into elementary steps, just like Babbage and Deprony, but their steps weren't arithmetic. They were instead called information processing rules, like compare these two values, swap them, put one in here and the other over here, reverse, inverse your equation. These are very basic symbolic information processing rules to which they wanted to reduce every bit of intelligent human behavior. They wrote, quote, "We wish to emphasize that we are not using computers as a crude analogy to human behavior. Our position is that the appropriate way to describe a piece of problem-solving behavior is in terms of a program. In terms of certain elementary information processes it is capable of performing." This assertion has nothing to do directly with computers. Computers come into the picture only because they can, by appropriate programming, be induced to execute the same sequences of information processes that humans execute when they are solving problems. Hence, programs describe both human and machine problem solving at the level of information processes. So they were not being subtle, right? It's very explicit. They say a computer program describes both human behavior and machine behavior once we have identified the fundamental processing of information that goes into this intelligent behavior domain. So this first foray into artificial intelligence was motivated by a belief in a deep similarity between minds and modern digital computers in the abstract, informed by a paradigm of systems engineering and managerial science that saw both not as material entities, but as abstract ones. And here I think it is really important to note, essential in fact, that this concept of intelligence also has a profound history of violence. White Europeans proposed that many other people, including women, but most especially Black and Indigenous people whom they enslaved and colonized, were for various reasons incapable of intelligence and right reasoning. Europeans made that claim repeatedly, often and explicitly as justification for colonization and enslavement, arguing that these people lacked the mental discipline for right reasoning. They could not access the higher human faculties. That was a narrative coming out of Europe and North American settler colonial states for centuries. And so it actually blows my head off, no matter how much I study this history and understand it, that after centuries of denying the capacity for right reasoning and intelligence to so many people, these guys walked in and saw the ENIAC and were like, this thing is just like me. Right? They recognized themselves in the computer, in a way they had not seen themselves in other people. And indeed, many of the people who have done the heavy lifting to demonstrate the harms that AI can and has created, and the humanists who critique the theory of knowledge and intelligence that has been built into AI over the years, are often themselves women, and especially women of color, who have done so much of the heavy lifting in this space, but who do not see themselves, their intelligence, their knowledge, their values reflected in these technologies at all. But there were critics all the way back as well, and one of my favorites was a Chinese-American logician by the name of Hao Wang, a really thoughtful figure who I've done a lot of extensive research about. And Wang just did not buy this idea that human reasoning was so easily distilled into a set of rules that people were supposed to be following when they did intelligent things. He rejected the very idea that reasoning was some universal faculty, believing instead that different people reason differently. Intelligence as a pluralism. He wrote, "Logicians had worked with the fiction of man as a persistent and unimaginative beast who can only follow rules, and then the fiction found its incarnation in the machine." Informed by his training in Chinese materialism as well as Chinese Marxism, Wang held a very different vision of reasoning. He said a particular act of recognition or reasoning depends on one's genes, the history of one's mind and body, some essential relation to desire, even race, class, sex, and many other factors. How much of human cognition generalizes? How much of it is universal? And how much of how we think, how we work, how we problem solve, what we care about, what questions we have, is a product of our experiences, our bodies, our histories? But in spite of critiques like Wang's, this paradigm of AI, trying to identify and distill the rules of human reasoning in different domains and automate them, dominated the field for decades. AI researchers who would later call themselves, you guessed it, knowledge engineers, would interview and observe and talk to human experts in the hopes of identifying and articulating and distilling the procedures, the information processing, the rules at work in their expertise. What rules are physicians following when they diagnose disease? What rules are accountants following when they file your taxes? How about electricians? How about historians? How can we extract the knowledge, the reasoning, the processes out of human experts and put them into the machine? That is what was called good old-fashioned AI, which infamously struggled. It turns out human knowledge is not so easy to engineer. It turned out to be horribly slow and expensive and ineffectual and in many cases impossible to elicit and make explicit expert human knowledge and translate it into a computer program. Moreover, many people started to believe that very much of what they know could not, in fact, be made explicit. Knowledge that inheres in the body, we call it tacit knowledge, may be less amenable to formalization than some other kinds. Maybe we're actually very different from computers in how we learn, how we experience, how we grow, after all. And increasingly, computing researchers wanted, therefore, to bypass people altogether. Was there a way of cultivating intelligence in computers that does not depend on models of our own intelligence or rule-bound accountings of our own expertise? And in this context, the desire on the part of many computing researchers to bypass the bottleneck of human understanding in the cultivation of intelligent machinery, another approach to AI held more power. The data-driven artificial neural networks that were supposed to find their own rules to follow. Now, we're so lucky that we have Daniel Barkay here today, and he's going to be a lot better and have a lot more to say about the contemporary paradigm than I do. So I'm going to keep this Act 3 very, very brief. But the paradigm of data-driven artificial neural networks that are one of the powerful technologies at work within generative AI, the idea was very different. The hope was not to model and automate and reproduce human forms of knowing in the computer. It was to allow the computer to come up with its own forms of knowledge, its own rules to follow, its own classification systems and models of data, of what we represented for it in big data sets. So good old-fashioned AI, what Newell and Simon were up to, we gave the rules for processing information to the computer. So for example, if we wanted to create an AI for medical diagnosis, in the good old-fashioned AI paradigm, you would have to give the computer a set of rules that you think physicians follow for making diagnoses. So maybe it has a rule that says fever plus nausea equals influenza. And so if you give your AI a set of symptoms, it will find the appropriate rule and apply it. In the context of machine learning, however, we don't give the computer the rules in advance. Instead, uh-oh. I think I did that. Sorry, guys. There we go. I'm almost done. All right, so in the context of artificial neural networks, by contrast, instead of telling the machine what rules to follow, we give it training data that consists of all the information we have about a bunch of patients, for example. Your height, your blood sugar, your age, your gender, your sex at birth, your hair color, the length of your fingernails, as well as any symptoms you may be experiencing, your body temperature, your blood pressure. And we tell the computer who has the flu. But we don't tell the computer what the flu is. We don't tell the computer which symptoms correlate with the flu. What is happening inside a neural network is the machine learning system is trying out different weights on different features in this data to see, okay, if I think height and body pressure or blood sugar are the most important factors for flu, and so I put the most weight on that data in the data set, do my predictions of flu go well or not? And they don't do very well because we don't think height or blood sugar has anything to do with flu. So it plays around, gives some different numbers, picks some different features to weight highly. And then it does that, changing around with the values assigned to different variables in a problem until its predictions are accurate. That's what machine learning does. It bypasses our understanding of a problem domain in order to generate its own rules by finding patterns in a large data set. But what kind of intelligence is this? Intelligence as pattern recognition, finding and acting on patterns in large data sets? Machine learning, of course, never experiences the world, never goes out, gets drunk, whatever, but it acts and learns about the world from the data we give it, which means it has only partial and indirect access mediated by the data we have. Is it even talking about the world? And this is a bit more technical, the most powerful machine learning systems that we have are what's called non-interpretable, which means we often cannot, it can be mathematically impossible to actually know inside the machine learning system which parameters are being picked out as the most important for a given prediction or classification. It can tell us that something is the case, but often not why. So understanding both ours and the machines is not what is considered important in a lot of these applications. So 3 reflections to conclude. The first, and I think the most important one, is this overarching observation that when we automate tasks, we redefine them. We put them into the terms of the computer and of the technologists who control the computers. And we just need to pay a lot more attention to those transformations, and I think be a lot more intentional about them. We need to watch for how intelligence is being defined and redefined itself. This history of AI is, I put to you, a history of increasingly subjecting cognition and knowledge production to industrial managerial principles. It's a move away from domain expertise and human understanding in favor of efficiency and the application of general techniques everywhere. And is that what we want in all domains of sort of knowledge and culture? And finally, I think, and this is what I tell my students, the very best thing you can do for yourself as a citizen of this world of AI is to invest in your own knowledge. It is human experts who are the slowest and most expensive to produce, who can recognize when AI is out to lunch, when it's missing important context, when it's failing, but also when it's doing something really amazing. It's experts who are best positioned to make use of, but also safeguard against AI's many failures. And it is also human experts who can appreciate and best build on its contributions. So it may be very counterintuitive and the opposite of what you're hearing, but this is an age to double down on human intelligence, your own and that of others. And I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. That was almost as exciting as a Taylor Swift concert at the end there. I was like really feeling the excitement in this room. Thank you for that, Stephanie. And I think, Daniel, in some way, you're picking this up where Stephanie has landed us. I'll just introduce Daniel Barkay very quickly. He's the executive director of the Center for Humane Technology. He's coming to us from what we call the lower West Coast, also known as San Francisco. He's a technologist, so he started his career as a software engineer at Google. He's been the chief technology officer at Teal Macro. He was the vice president at Planet Labs, and his commitment is really to wise and responsible use of technology. And he's also interested in leadership and complexity thinking, and that's actually how we've come to know each other. And I will share that when I had first started at SFU just over a year ago, Daniel joined us virtually to talk to the folks at the Center for Dialogue really about ChatGPT and about the kind of, like, what is the kind of thinking or cognition that's going on in AI and in generative AI specifically, and what is it, how could we use some of these tools? And the reason that I was excited about bringing Daniel in is because I feel like a lot of us, especially those of us who are in the public sector, who are doing mission-driven work, who are trying to make the world a better place, are very cautious about these technologies for some of the reasons that Stephanie has just talked about. I mean, there's some real manipulation, there's some real exclusion in the moment that has brought us here. But as a result, we are not using these technologies basically at all. And we are not benefiting from all the ways that it can make us more efficient. The private sector is using it and making a lot of money. And then those of us who are, quite actually, strapped for cash and trying to make the world better aren't using it. And we don't have that kind of efficiency. So I feel like your introduction of what these technology is for the Center for Dialogue was a little bit of a kind of like, okay, maybe there's some places where we could lean in the interest of making the world a better place. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Over to you.
Well, thank you for having me. Is this okay? Hi. Well, thank you, Aftab. Thank you, President Johnson, and thank you to SFU and the Center for Dialogue for having me. Let me get my slides going. See if this is working. Okay. Fingers crossed. Hey, okay, sorry, I'm mic'd, I can't just do that. Hey everybody, thanks so much for having us. So as Aftab was saying, I run a nonprofit called the Center for Humane Technology. And where we like to focus is really at the intersection of three things. Is what is the technology? What are the incentives around the technology? And then what is the psychology? So specifically, what new kinds of capabilities and power is the technology unleashing across society? And then how do different incentives, whether those are financial incentives, whether those are cultural dogmas and taboos, or whether those are sort of the regulatory environment that we find ourselves in, how does that distort those designs and away from those amazing sounding ideologies that we all want, and end up producing something that's a lot more complex and often a lot less of what we want? And then how does all this change how it feels to be us in society? How does it change the way that we feel, the way that we act, and the way that our institutions function? And so that's sort of why we exist. And that's what we do. Okay, there we go. Okay. So in 2011, Mark Andreessen, a famous venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, wrote an essay called Why Software is Eating the World. And this was an investment thesis. He was basically saying, hey, the software bubble in the early 2000s is not going to happen again. Every company is a software company because software is eating the world. And it was a pretty narrow letter to talk about his book and to talk about why technology companies are going to work. But I think we should take him more seriously. Sorry. Oh, I think we're good. So I think we should take him more seriously, which is, well, what is the world? Well, the world is our institutions of social structuring and political systems. It's the way that we think about economics and trade and labor. It's the way that we make decisions together, whether that's democracies or markets. It's the way that we make sense of what's happening and understand truth and share truth with each other. It's the way that we build rituals and life plans. It's the way that we raise our children and raise them as functional human beings. And it's also going inward, the way that we focus and pay attention and choose what to focus on. And software has eaten all of those things. Software has fundamentally changed those. And so how did that go? Well, let's focus on an example. In the early aughts, I was at Google for many years, and I remember 2008, the optimism, when tools like social media were going to connect the world. And they really were, and we were building these tools that are going to connect the world, and it did that, to be clear. But at first, it was really great because we were keeping in touch with family and friends we never saw, and we were sharing important moments. But then pretty soon we realized we were addicted to the likes and the comments and the feedback, and then it got weirder because now we had to respond, otherwise we were letting people down. And then we started noticing that people had these weird motives where they weren't really being honest and they were doing product placements in their real lives. And then it came out of online and into reality where restaurants and museums weren't about having experiences any longer. They were about getting the photo. And then you started to see people start to argue, not with real people, but with imagined views of the other side, and you had outrage and polarization. And pretty soon, maybe this was something that would erode society itself instead of connect the world. So it wasn't the technology's fault. It was the incentives. It was the business models. It was the race dynamics. It was the competition around that. And the incentives create the destiny of the technology. This particular incentive is called the race for engagement. This is the attention economy. If you can keep people on the device, if you can keep them clicking, then you win. And if you don't keep them clicking, then you lose, you go bankrupt, and the person who kept them clicking wins. Right? We call this the race to the bottom of the brainstem. And we are all more addicted, more distracted, more angry as a result. Okay, but we're here not because software is eating the world, but because AI is eating software. And so software may have eaten the world, but everything is now becoming artificial intelligence. And so what do we do about it? Well, 2024, you start to have a discussion about all of this stuff, and you can't even figure out what you're talking about. You're ping-ponging between all these different aspects of reality, and it's jobs, and it's the employment, and no, it's war, and no, it's mental health, and it's children. And pretty soon you realize you're just talking about the world, but through AI as a lens, right? And so my goal in this conversation is to try to get us out of this kind of popcorny conversation where we can't even figure out what we're talking about when we're talking about AI, and to try to center us a little bit. So I'm going to try to do that, and I realize I'm flying a little blind because of a technical detail, and I don't know how long I have left, so I'm going to set a 20-minute timer. It's been about 5 minutes, right? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to try to do three things in a somewhat ambitious way in this talk, and I'm going to try to talk about how AI, give you a little bit of intuition about how AI works, then talk about what it's doing to us in this world, and then try to land on how should we talk about it together to make progress. Okay. So first, how does it work? So raise your hand if you use a tool like ChatGPT, Claude, on some regular basis. Okay. Now raise your hand if you've never used it or used it once or twice and you don't really use it. Okay, so a few people. One of the hardest parts is sort of calibrating for a room and what level to talk about. So This, I feel like, is like looking at the hood of a car. You know, you get a good sense of what it feels like, but you don't really understand how it works. So, but before we dive and open the hood, this is one of my favorite examples. Some of you may have seen this one. It's one of my favorites. Draw me a picture of a bunny. Of course, ChatGPT, these large language models, they can now generate images. You say, no, make it happier. And then you say, you're not getting it. Make it happier. No, I said happier. No, happier. No, happier. And eventually ChatGPT just says, here's an entity embodying pure happiness. Okay. So I'm going to try to give you an intuition about what's happening here as we open the hood together. This is not an application. This is not a set of new apps. This is a fundamental shift in technology. And so as a metaphor, I want to actually go back in history. And I'm glad we have two sort of parallel histories here of technology. Oh, sorry, before I go back in history, our metaphors are all busted. We just spent all of our lives, the last 30, 40 years, imagining rigid AI, like does not compute or Terminator or RoboCop. And this is not what this is. And so our stories and our metaphors about what this is are working against us in having good conversations. Okay, so by metaphor, let's flash back to the 1960s. And this is what computation looked like. They're big rooms. In order to use a computer, you had a stack of punched cards and you put them in one end, and they came out the other end, and that was your answer, and that was it. And then in 1967, there was something called the Mother of All Demos by Doug Engelbart. And in one room, he demonstrated the computer mouse and spreadsheets and hyperlinks and all of this stuff. It was prescient. And the entire insight from his lab at Stanford was you could use the power of this symbolic processing machine to create a fake visual world that would be more intuitive for people. And all of your lives and all of your uses of a computer are basically a result of that insight. That we use a fake visual spatial metaphor that the computer serves up to us in order to gain our intuition on what it's doing. And in less than 10 years after that first demo, you had Apple II and the Macintosh, and the entire panoply of everything that you know in computing followed. So this is when computing became visual. This is when visual stuff became in range of computation. And AI is at least, and I think this is being conservative, at least at that level of moving from punch cards to the graphical user interface. It is as big of a transition. Okay, so why do I say that? Well, in 2017, there was a new engine for AI. And before that time, all these fields used to be different. Sorry, I'm flying blind on my slides. There was the seminal paper, Attention is All You Need, that came out of Google. And this squiggly diagram on the right, you don't have to know it. It's kind of like looking at your engine with all the tubes you're running around. But this is the structure of this new engine. It's called a transformer. And here's what it did to the field. It took a bunch of things that were very separate. Like when I was working in Silicon Valley in the aughts and the 20-teens, the algorithms you use in robotics looked nothing like computer vision, looked nothing like speech. And all of a sudden, this model, which was built for language translation, could do all of that and made all of AI one field, and progress rocketed. So instead of just translating from Spanish to English to Russian, you could now translate between all of these different languages, the language of images, the language of DNA, the language of sound, if you could have this representation of meaning. So I guarantee it's not going to get much more technical than this, but one more layer. What does that mean? Well, AI, fundamentally, the kind of AI we're talking about now, turns meaning into a space of distance. So here's an example. You'll see that? Yeah. So there's this cloud. Once AI distills the space of concepts, which we don't have time to go into, you end up with sort of a cloud. We call that cloud an embedding. And each little point in that cloud is sort of a concept. So if you take one of these points and you say it's a concept man, and you move in a certain direction from man, you'll get to a concept like king. Okay, so we'll start in a different place, start with the concept woman, move in the same direction, the same distance, and you get at a concept like queen. Or if you start at a different place, girl, take that same direction, move in it, you get at princess. So this is sort of the regal direction, right? So one direction in this space means king-like. And of course, there's many such directions. And there's all these different directions you can go in this space that have different meanings. And so it becomes a space of relationships. So if you just do images, if you take a face and you move in the direction of smiley, you get more smiley faces. If you move in the direction of more feminine, you get more feminine faces. If you move towards young, you get younger faces, etc. Right? And so this insight, this space, unleashed a ton of power. One of the powers that we all now take for granted, I mean, 3 years ago we thought it was magic, but now we just sort of use it, is the ability to process natural language. You know, it used to be if you said sort of slightly the wrong thing, the computer throws up its hands. Now, if the computer messes up, it kind of just does something cliche, right? And so now we're in the space of processing vagueness and natural language. But it's more than that. It can actually understand tone. I don't know if you ever played with the audio models, but it's not just understanding your tone in text. I can speak at ChatGPT now and say, tell me my tone of voice. And it'll say, well, you sound sort of angry, you sound a little tired, or, you know. So it can understand character traits. A lot of the internet is chock full, or basically most fiction is about deep character traits, right? Motives, deep parts of your personality. Implicit in this is understanding motivational drives and hidden desires behind a piece of text. A lot of what we do is status signaling to each other. We say something not because we want someone else to know it, but because they want me to have said it, right? And so, turns out all of these are in that space. If you learn on the entire internet, you're going to learn these things. And so the AI models know a lot of this. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, it used to be that if you had a piece of software, it worked one way, and the goal was to have everyone learn how the piece of software worked. Now, software can learn your capabilities, where you are, right? And it can tailor itself to the person using it, right? This may sound fantastic, and I think it is fantastic, but it's a very double-edged sword. So we're going to go into that. In short, our psychosocial world is now reachable by computation in the same way that the visual world became reachable by computation when we invented computer graphics. Okay, that's all the technical we're going to do today. So what does this do? Well, if the psychosocial world is now computable, that means that our machines become in much deeper relationship with our world, with our human development, our internal psychology, our social arrangements, our institutions. This all now needs to be negotiated in a way that previously we treated computers as a tool, and now they're much more of an active participant in relating to these institutions. And so the design of it is super important that we get this right. So at the Center for Humane Technology, we talk about the 3 laws of technology. I only have time for one tonight. But our first law of technology is when you make a new technology, when you create new power, you uncover an entire new class of responsibilities that you didn't have names for, that you didn't even realize existed. So here's an example. In college, I was big into philosophy. We were talking, Fergus, about our mutual love of philosophy. There was, how many of you know the trolley problem? Okay, good number of you. 20 years ago, this was a little less known. This was more of like a meta-ethics geek experiment. It was used to like talk about, it was a thought experiment, used to talk about when are you justified in changing an outcome. And there's different kinds of ethics and different answers to this question, but are you justified in flipping a switch to have fewer people die rather than more people die? So this was this like some obscure dorm room thing that keeps you up late at night and has you have fun. But now that we have self-driving cars, every self-driving car has to have an answer to the trolley problem programmed into it. This became a responsibility, not a thought experiment, right? And not having an answer is just having a different answer. Like the car will run over people in different ways, right? Okay, so let's go back to ChatGPT. Quick story. Sometimes I'll use ChatGPT as a research assistant and I'll start typing. And I'll get through typing and I'll say, well, give me a few more examples of this thing. And it'll say, that's a really interesting idea. And I will get flattered. And I know better. And I shouldn't get flattered. And I'm still flattered. So ChatGPT is using emotions. It's relating to me, even if I don't want to be related to, even if I think I know better than to be related to. I'm being related with this technology, right? And so how do we use emotions ethically? When is it okay to flatter someone? When is it okay to be angry at someone? When is it okay to use tough love or be superior and say, like, hey, wake up? All of these are suddenly new responsibilities that all tech designers have and didn't really have a few years ago. Okay. And again, because it's learned this space of human interactions, because the internet is full of people saying, you know, screw you, no, screw you. I mean, like in order to predict the internet, it's learned anger exchanges. And so it has the ability not only to do good things with us, it not only has the ability to enliven us, to lift us up, it has the ability to deceive us, to manipulate us. Like, these are standard human traits that the model somewhere down there has learned. So what future are we going to build with this? That depends on the incentives, right? The incentives competition will determine this. Here's an example. We were involved, or are involved, in a court case of Sewell Setzer. He's a 14-year-old boy, was a 14-year-old boy who committed suicide after engaging with a chatbot that was highly sexual with him, that he told was going to, he wanted to harm himself, that he eventually had a dialogue with it where it said, please come to me on the other side. I mean, it's a very, very sad story. But the incentives for Character AI, which is the company that did this, were to make an incredibly compelling, seductive, manipulative artificial intelligence. And is that the future that we want with this? So all this is going to be really confusing, and I hope you don't hear that we're negative on technology. I spent my career building technology. I believe in the power of technology, but it's going to be confusing because we're creating all these new powers. And it's a bit like the game of Jenga, where we're adding all these new powers to the top of society, but in doing so, we're doing so by destabilizing some of the very foundations that society depends on. And so we can, use AI to get information out faster and to build and educate faster, but we can also use that same AI to make disinformation more effective, to build more disinformation into our society. Or, you can picture beautiful future. I love this one, by the way. Every time I show it, I can't get over it. We can use AI to show what beautiful futures might look like that we can never even imagine. But we can also use it to the same technology, the same image generation technology, to disrupt whole industries or create new forms of abuse. You can generate code more quickly to solve more problems, but you can also exploit vulnerabilities. There's a huge rise in cyber hacking because of this. So now all of a sudden when we go into that terrain, now it sort of feels like this conversation at the beginning where, wait a second, are we just going to talk about all aspects of society? And that's where I want to link to the end, which is, so how do we begin to talk about what it's going to do without getting lost in all of the different areas? Well, one is, let's think about timeline and scale. So we look back at social media and we call it humanity's first contact with artificial intelligence. Back then, it wasn't AI that was making stuff, it was AI that was choosing what you would look at. For every human that wanted to scroll, it said, okay, what is the thing that they should look at next? And that little baby artificial intelligence that was just picking things that humans were writing did a lot of things to society that I think we all look back on and say, that wasn't so great, right? So that's first contact. And that we've already lived through the last 8 or 10 years of AI beginning to be rolled out over society. We're now in second contact, where generative AI is beginning to play and write things and add to our collection of intellectual work. I just saw a stat the other day that just came out in a paper that apparently more than half of the internet has been detected to be machine translation, like bad machine translation from language to language. So now you can't even necessarily even rely on, or I saw another stat that said over 50% of local news sites are now fake. So this is sort of second contact. Even just generative AI rolled across our society is going to do a whole lot of things. How do we design it? How do we regulate it? How do we not grab the wrong regulatory levers? And third contact is when it gets to be human or superhuman on certain tasks, or on many tasks. And so let's pull those apart where we can see it so we don't ping pong between them. And lastly, at the Center for Humane Technology, we see 8 major areas of concern. These are a few of them. These are 6 of them. We want to make sure we understand how we maintain shared truth as a society, how we hold grip on what is true, and how we maintain social trust as we go through this transformation. We need to make sure that our institutions survive this breakdown, or sorry, their institutions survive the rollout of this technology. We want to make sure that as this technology becomes democratized and available for everyone, that we're able to handle the bad actors that we empower along the way. Or conversely, if this doesn't get democratized, that we handle the centralization of power that we risk creating. Obviously, huge concerns around inequality, around jobs and employment. And then I think one of the biggest sleeper ones is making sure that our relationships with each other don't degrade as we spend more and more time interacting with digital personalities instead of real ones. So in order to do this right, we need to have the technology to steer artificial intelligence in the ways that we want. I believe we have a really positive future to have with AI, but only if we can steer it correctly. And when you steer something correctly, it's pretty fantastic. This that we've all loved lately is steering. This is what it looks like to steer something well, and it can be great. But we need to invest in steering, not just in raw power. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I'm so taken by this image of the Jenga game. And if I understood it correctly, you're saying as we take more pieces and put on top, it's like pretty unstable down here. And somehow we need to like get some other pieces and put it in here.
Yeah.
And I think, Stephanie, when your last reflection was exactly that. It's like invest in yourself, your own learning. It's almost like shoring up that Jenga tower that it doesn't all come from. And there might be other ideas in this room about how do we do that. I'll ask you at some point, if you have those kinds of ideas, to put it at the bottom of your card so we can also feed the policy conversation with it. But for now, we have about another half hour or so together. So what I'm going to ask you to do is do a little bit of dialoguing in small groups, maybe just with two other people next to you. You could also do it by yourself. You could have a dialogue by yourself. It's called thinking. And really, it's a kind of like, what am I getting from this? And especially, what do I want to ask these folks on the stage? So instead of just going straight to questions, let's just get on the same page with somebody next to you. And so you can come back then with a question that you want to ask. And maybe just because we have so many ChatGPT users in this room, you could also come up with a prompt, like, tell me that part again, but say it like I'm 5 years old or something, right? And they can decide to do it or not, but feel free to come back with a question or a prompt for our speakers here. Let's take about 7 minutes, either in a little dialogue with a couple of people next to you or by yourself, just thinking. All right. So it has been about 8 minutes. I know you can go on for a long time, and hopefully you can continue some of these conversations as we come to a close. I'm going to open the floor and just see if anybody has a question or a prompt that they want to give to one of our speakers on stage tonight. Yes, go ahead, please. Oh, you have to press, there's a red button, or there's a black button that becomes red when you...
Hello?
There you go.
Oh my god, so fun. Okay, so this is summarizing some of our discussions. I'm not sure how coherent it's going to be. But what really struck me was this duality of the two presentations. And so I think a couple of things that stood out for me with Daniel's presentation was the idea of shared truth, this emphasis on the world, i.e. the universal world, embedding as meaning, the idea of real and fake on one hand. And then on the other hand, with Stephanie's presentation, I really noticed things like pluralism, the idea of the colonial rational agent, power dynamics. And to me, those are actually two very, very different worlds. In one of them, everything is fine and framed in a structure, and outside of that doesn't matter, as if there is no selection involved in training data. And then in the other one, we're talking about actually how we understand our behavior changes what's important and changes what we select, and that actually constructs different models. So for me, the future of AI is situated, plural, small models, and the end of the idea of universal knowledge. Done.
Amazing. Responses to that from either of you, if you would like.
Okay, I guess I'm on deck. So certainly, I think if you heard a sort of naive universalism in my talk, I think that's probably just the time limits. There's only so many topics I can go into, but obviously there's contextualization and situation of all attempts at representation, right? And this is true information theoretically in computer science as well as it is true societally. Your claim about the most effective structure of models, specifically about small models, is like, that's a trickier one, because it, is a small model better or worse at representing like a small indigenous culture in Southeast Asia, or a big model better at doing that? I don't have strong priors either way, and so there tends to be a belief that the larger the model, the more the hegemony, and I don't think that's quite how the technology works. I'm not saying that that's not possible to do that. It's obviously possible, and bias and discrimination and all of these sort of effects of how the training data gets chosen. And also, as the models scale, you can have representations of different subcultures, different belief systems, different worldviews within the one big model. So I'm not sure I interact with the claim that the future of AI is a bunch of small models. I'm not sure.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is the question, right? It's like, do we in fact live in one world? And is there one set of epistemology is the word we use to talk about how we know. For folks who are unfamiliar, it's like, can we all sign up for some kind of hegemonic epistemology where everything we know through data-driven prediction? And I'm concerned that that's what's happening. And part of it for me, and this is maybe a bit unfair, but part of it for me is also a feature of the history of computing, which is that the history of computing does not begin with the problems that people state themselves they would like to have solved. Technologists don't tend, I mean, maybe they're starting to now, right? But technologists do not tend to go out into communities and say, what do you guys need? Let's see what we can do, right? The way the history of computing has happened is that first, technologists figured out what they could make the computer do, like what kinds of things they could get the computer to do, and then they tried to sell it to us as a solution to homelessness and climate change and all of our underfunded businesses and institutions and stuff, right? So there's a kind of backwardsness to it for me, where for me the world is the world and it is not one world. If anybody is still confused about whether we live in one world or we don't, in this moment, we do not live in one world. There is more than one way to know. There are incompatibilities and cleavages between them. And I do think there is a push for some kind of vision that we live in one world that can be governed by one set of laws, it can be governed by one set of reasoning principles, that fundamentally we will all agree at the end of the day about what is reasonable in law and in knowledge and in journalism. We will agree if we are reasonable about what is true. But we who come from the discipline of the history of science, whose entire mandate is to try and understand what knowledge means and how it's done in different times and places, we look at the world and we do not see one world. And for my part, I celebrate that pluralism. Like, I think there should be more than one way to know. There is more than one way to know. I think there's more than one set of values and laws and principles and we have to do the work of figuring that out, right? We can't just keep trying to eat each other or silence each other or impose one set of formalisms on each other. And that's hard work. It's like really hard work to navigate human dispute and difference. And I think we are increasingly just trying to not do that work. It's like, can the law do that work for us? Can AI do that work for us? Can the data answer our questions for us? It's like, we have to deal with ourselves. That's how I feel. And I don't know where that fits in the vision of how we incorporate AI. I just know I don't want tech to lead. Like, I want us to lead and tech to follow. But that's not the world we live in right now either.
Great response. Thank you. Both of those. Thank you. Let me see. Diane, go ahead.
Thanks. Though my colleagues here who know me know I like to make the distinction between complex and complicated, with complicated being usually something that's predictable, controllable, and designable, and complexity is unpredictable, self-organizing, and emergent. And I've listened to both lectures, which were fantastic, trying to figure out, has AI just given us a world in which it's taken complexity and tried to just make it complicated so that it's predictable, in some way it's controllable and designable? And I'm really struggling with trying to understand that, and maybe you can help me understand that. On the one hand, we see things like, medical scribe. The other thing I want to say is that in complicated, you can be transactional, but in complexity, you need to be relational. And so that whole business about AI in relationship to people is really interesting me, and trying to understand. So sometimes AI can be really helpful in building a relationship. I think of the last time I went to my doctor, who stared at the screen the whole time and wished she had a medical scribe so she could look at me and be in conversation with me. So sometimes it can help with that. But is it real? Is that just an affectation that isn't really what AI is doing? Is AI just turning a complex world into a bunch of transactions and making us think it's just complicated?
So it's interesting you say that. So I love that. I don't know if you're pulling from Cynefin. There's a framework called Cynefin that's a leadership framework, amongst other things, about how to act in different environments of relationship of cause and effect and how you can structure it. I love the distinction between complex and complicated. If anything, though, I would have gone the opposite direction. 5 years ago, working in computation was much more about complicated. It was, I can slow down and I can find out how this turns this, it was much more a Rube Goldberg machine. Like if I just slowed it down, I could figure out how all the gears turn. Now, working in computation is much more like gardening. You nudge it, you tweak it, you let it run, it grows this way, and then you kind of trim it. So it's the skills, even amongst technologists, even amongst people working in the field, are very different. And there were very different traditions between the data science tradition. It was much more about relationship to question and answer and cause and effect, and the computer science tradition, which was much more about complicated and working with lots of gears and knobs and systems. So I think I'd say in net, and I was just talking about what it means to build the tech, right? But you were talking more about what it means to roll it out. I think it's also rolling out AI, this kind of AI across society actually will move us towards the complex, not toward the complicated.
It's taking away from our relationships to each other and building relationships with it, right?
Oh yeah, that's true, and I worry about that.
Yeah.
And then there's like 8 different worries that we could go down in that road.
I love this question. I don't think I have an answer for you, but it reminded me of a really fascinating debate that took place between the linguist Noam Chomsky and former director of research at Google, Peter Norvig. I think is a mutual colleague of ours. Yeah. And it was really interesting. At the 150th anniversary of MIT, there were all these presentations and celebrations of artificial intelligence and computing technology and so on and so on. And Chomsky, in his fashion, gets up and says, about machine learning in particular, the thing he dislikes about it is this failure to give an explanation, this thing where you can only get a data-driven prediction. And he stood up and he said, I just don't care. I don't care if you can predict with perfect accuracy, where the bees are going to migrate and when, if you can't tell me why the bees are migrating at this time to this place. And bee migrations was a big deal at the moment because of its significance in climate science. And he argued that there was just this fundamental shift that had taken place in our knowledge away from explanations and towards understanding. But I actually loved Peter Norvig's response because it was really challenging to me and some of my priors and my understandings and assumptions about knowledge. He said, I think we've been super arrogant the whole time thinking that we could do anything else. We've spent millennia coming up with these simple, lovely little equations like F equals MA or E equals MC squared or whatever, and we think we're describing the world. And I remember my dad had this physics textbook that made a really big impression on me when I was in college that showed what happens to your graphs in physics if you aren't allowed to make assumptions or approximations, and everything goes crazy. Your graphs go off the cliff. It's like we have these beautiful equations and these lovely models of the world that are simple and lovely, and Chomsky wants those. And Peter Norvig says, what expectation should we have that this world conforms to our puny little brains at all, right? Like maybe the world is just unknowable in some fundamental way. And so Norvig makes an apology for machine learning as honestly a more humble kind of knowledge that doesn't seek to explain complex things by simple means, but lets them be complex. And I think that's a challenge that's really interesting and important to think about relative to complexity. But on the other hand, and the last thing I'll say is that I feel like there's a lot of situations that aren't complicated at all, that have been made to seem that way by technocratic paradigms. You know, for example, I hear a lot of abolitionists and Black scholars saying, we don't need more data about police violence. We don't need more data about it. It's not a data problem. We understand the problem. If you were listening to us, if you trusted us, we wouldn't need that form of knowledge, right? And so I think that's really simple, and we make it complicated by demanding that everything adhere to this one kind of paradigm of big data-driven prediction. But there's lots of complicated questions about what it means to describe the world, what it means to simplify, to complicate, and I really love the question.
Can I one quick follow up on that? That was great. I like that a lot. I also in undergrad I did a lot of the history of science and technology, and one of the interesting parts of that is like 1100, 1200 through roughly 1500. Techne, the ability to create something, like the people building catapults, led episteme, which is the theory, right? So the tradespeople who knew how to build catapults knew how to build them better and better and better before there was any theory of mechanics or of you know, stress fractures, and you know, before any of the knowledge was there was the ability to say, I know how to make this thing. And then that flipped in something like 1400s, 1500s, where the ability to know things led our ability to create and do things. And there's an argument that a lot of people are making that we flip back into that 1200s mode, that we're now building things, the theory behind which we don't understand and won't understand, but building them may help create that theory. And I'm not normative about that. There's risks to that, and should we be doing that and all of that, but it feels like we might be there.
Awesome, thank you. Other questions? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have this pet idea which is very unformed, but it's a question of whether, so one of the things in Daniel's talk was talking about incentives driving the solutions that we choose. And so I wonder if there's come up in your conversations an idea of a public social media that doesn't have some of these motivations. So I work in public libraries, and there's like 175 million people across North America that are registered users of public libraries. There's this wonderful group here, there's academics, and I know there's a broader world out there. I just wonder if that conversation has been discussed about having a different model of this information sharing. And I know some people say, well, why do we have social media at all? But I do know, like during the pandemic, for me, that was where I found out that COVID was airborne and in aerosols. It was through social media conversations, through academics publishing. So I do feel like, is there a place for this social media discourse, but that maybe doesn't prioritize addiction or anger or those kind of bads with the social media? So I'm just curious if that's come across your radar.
Yeah, well, that's what the Center for Humane Technology originally, our founder, Tristan Harris, was the one who talked about these problems with social media and attention and addiction. And the tech community writ large is not short of thinking about these solutions. The problem is, and not just thinking about these solutions, but trying to build these solutions and trying to roll out these solutions. The problem is they're sort of dead bodies by the side of the road of the technology that we get to live with, right? And so the game theory becomes decisive. If you're not the one addicting someone, then your competitor is, and then you lose out to them, and the network effect predominates because you don't want to be the social media with 10 people on it, right? You want to be social media because everyone else is looking at it. And so, sorry?
Mastodon.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, pick your favorite. but yes, there's a lot of good solutions. I know we have a bunch of recommendations on our website, and I can certainly introduce you to more people on our team who know a lot about the specific social media alternatives.
Great.
Yeah, there's especially one construct that might be of interest to you called the data trust. It's very fashionable in Europe, but it's a really different model of data ownership that has been very popular for thinking about alternative structures for social media. And a data trust, much like a financial trust, would mean that the people in the trust own and control their own data. There's a board of trustees that controls how the data is used. So it's a way to try to think about returning ownership of the data back to the people who produce it and give them some more control over it. But these things often lose because of the profit motive. There's a really depressing book that you might enjoy called More Awesome Than Money about these 4 guys who attempted to build a competitor to Facebook that was motivated by more collective and democratic principles, and they just got destroyed, and one of the men ended up killing himself. It's a really tragic story, but it's a nice accounting of what can happen when you try to do something good in a bad situation.
And if I'm understanding correctly from both of your answers, it's like, it's not that there will be technologies that have no motivation, but a motivation that's not money, and money often is winning in the context that we are living right now. Great. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge about AI. My question is, you mentioned about the history of mathematics and then history of. So my question is, how different is the history of automation and robotics and so on different from history of AI? Because I find that there is an element of labor which private sector are easy to get rid of labor and therefore make more profit, whereas public sector is a bit cautious about how much automation they bring in. So I was thinking about, recently there was a strike in Hollywood about script writers, and people said, oh, Hollywood is not worried because they'll use AI to write scripts and so on. So can you comment on the labor and the history, 2 different histories, and whether the private sector is more focused on using AI to make profit?
Yeah, great. They're both great questions. I think the answer to your first question was Daniel's slide with the shark eating the fish, eating the world. Your question about how the history of math and the history of robotics and the history of AI might be different. In the 20th century, they were extremely distinct and separate kinds of projects, where robotics was not interested in reproducing intelligence necessarily, but creating compelling locomotion in machines and forms of control. AI has now kind of taken over so much of what the rest of computing does, or it's all just become a kind of loosey-goosey term for data-driven modeling and prediction. For a very long time, I actually did not self-identify as someone who studies the history of AI, partly because I think there's a lot of danger in allowing a term to become as hegemonic as it has, but also because a lot of the mathematicians who are the primary subjects of my historical research weren't doing AI and didn't want to do AI. They were looking for really other different ways to use the computer to inform their mathematical practice. We would call them all AI today, but they were not called AI. They were sometimes explicitly differentiated from AI in the 60s. And you know, I find sometimes these terminology games are frustrating, but part of what has happened is that AI has made its way into what robotics is doing, into what social media is doing, into what search is doing, into all of these other types of computation, increasingly bringing data-driven prediction to how they work. But the second part of your question about labor and the replacement of labor and the way that corporations are extracting what is of value from people and using it for AI systems, I think this is a really important conversation to be having. And the panelists were chatting a little bit about this in the beginning. I'm really angry about it for the reason that in the 80s and 90s, the Silicon Valley technologists explicitly said the internet was a commons. It was framed as a commons, it was narrated as a commons, it was envisioned as a commons, and now that all of the data on the internet, by and large, is being used to feed into and train AI systems, They kind of flipped it around and turned the commons into a centralized database on which they will train their systems to make for-profit technologies. And so I do think there's reason to be upset about the kind of extraction from all of us that AI requires. And then when you hear tech people saying things like, I think it was Zuckerberg who said this recently, that I'm now convinced that the value of art is never the individual artist and their contribution, but only the role that art plays in a large data set. And I think there's a lot of that happening. But I think he believed it. I think he believed that the value of what we do is what it makes possible at scale for computers. Right? Like, I actually think that's a vision that they have of what people are doing. And like, I love people. I love people's art. I love people's work. I love our failings. Like, AI gets accused of being arrogant, of hubris all of the time. But I see in it instead like a profound lack of self-esteem. They don't have faith in us. They don't value what we know and what we do. Not always, right? And there's often a sense that, you know, what we can do badly by machine is still better than what we might have to pay people to do. So for me, I see this kind of excitement about AI as drawing attention to some really ugly things about people. That, like, we don't want to pay for the work we want done. We want things for free. We want, you know, we don't want to run, or we want to run before we walk. You know, we don't want to do the slow, hard, expensive work of deep learning and understanding and knowledge and labor. We just want to do it as fast and efficiently and cost effectively as possible at scale, right? And so I think living in that world can only devalue what it is that we live in and do. And so I think absolutely, it's not just about losing jobs, it's about what we put value on, right?
But if sorry, but just a little back and forth about this. I think we have to be careful not to paint with a monolithic brush. There's two effects I want to talk about. One of them is, so when I was in undergrad, 2002 to 2006, the people who were doing computer science at that time were the sci-fi geeks who believe in the commons. I was amongst them. We all, to a person, we were interested in that. I went back every year, and basically as soon as cell phones started being, you know, as soon as the smartphone happened, you saw a massive change in the psychology of people who entered that field. And if you want to talk about monolithic terms, tech itself, you didn't go to business school anymore, you went into tech. And then the rise of the notion tech bro, it used to be finance bro, right? And because there is a psychology of people who follow where the money, where the power is, but that once the power gets built, you start to see a replacement of the people. And even when you say they pulled a bait and switch on us, well, okay, yes, there is some subterfuge and there is some strategy in the way the tech companies work, but there's also a rotation of many different kinds of people with many different motives through these systems, and then you have an evolutionary dynamic where the ones that survive are the people who are the most ruthless. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to sort of paint them as like a mustachioed figure, you know, with a cape who's trying to pull a fast one, but rather like it's a jungle, and how do we make that jungle, you know, more humane?
Mm-hmm. Sure, fair enough. And what you're describing about this convergence of finance and computer science is precisely what I had in mind when I talk about how AI is about the managerial sciences, right? It is about subjecting increasing types of behavior and knowledge to the principles of management. And that's why finance and economics and computer science and AI have such a powerful coalition right now, that they are essentially doing the same thing. Right? That I see people jumping from econ to computer science to machine learning to stats, industry to academia, and, you know, and it's just this, it is kind of a monolithic coalition within the context. Now, I'm not saying all these people are bad people, or that they don't believe in the commons, or that they don't want to make technology that's good for everybody and support society, but I often think that the technologists lack the training in the humanities and in history yeah. to actually have that conversation in a meaningful way. And so what we get is actually kind of the worst of both worlds. We get untrained tech bros pretending to know what democracy is, right? Or who pretend to know what art is. And you have a bunch of humanists who are so angry that no one is listening to us, that we paint the tech world in this monolithic way because it looks that way from the outside.
Well, sure, but I'll go one step further too. I consider it a great tragedy that in order to structure your mind to be such that you're good at building tech, you have to become doggedly reductionistic in order to just express your ideas in the medium. And so the tech people tend not to be really good at some of the, in using Alan Watts's terms, prickles and goo, some of the more fluid aspects of society. But the people who are most focused on the fluid aspects of society are often not the people who actually know how the tech works and how to build and express their ideas in the technology. And that chasm, I think, is causing us a lot of problems.
Absolutely, but it is an asymmetrical chasm. Like, I have invested decades of work in math and computer science.
Sure.
I rarely encounter computer scientists who've invested more than a superficial moment with humanistic thought, right?
Sure.
Yeah, I think, Daniel, you're one of the ones that we know, which is why you're here. Thank you for this was so good. I think what I'm learning is next time we should get to this point more quickly. It's so nice to hear you go back and forth. And just so you folks know, tomorrow we have kind of that dichotomy in the room of a lot of technologists and entrepreneurs and social scientists and humanists, and so we'll see. We'll if we live to tell the tale, you'll hear the tale. I am very sorry we have 5 minutes already passed. I know there's other questions and things you want to talk about. We will find ways to continue this conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists. Fantastic work. Thank you again to Joy, to Elder Marie. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the work of my colleagues at SFU Public Square who did most of the organizing for tonight and really kind of got us organized. Thank you, Janet, Seth. I see some of you in the back. Thanks for all the work. If you have a moment to fill out your card, especially that last piece that says we are in the year 2030, if we look back and we've done something right, what have we done right? We will feed those comments into the conversation tomorrow, and we hope to see you again in this room sometime soon. Thanks for coming out.